Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another exciting episode of These Are a pair of $1 reading glasses from the dollar store that work better than a $15 pair from Walgreens. This episode is about my dad. I'm going to try to give you some information about him, tell you something about his history, because I'm in this group on Facebook, 329th Transportation Company. My father was a company commander for a while, for a year, during his tour in Vietnam. He took over from a captain, and a captain took over from him, even though my dad was a major at the time. He retired as a major, although if he wouldn't have resigned his commission, he probably would at least have been a full colonel, possibly a brigadier general. I don't think he would have gone above brigadier, but he was on the fast track. And my dad started off as an NCO. And my dad basically earned his rank. It wasn't given to him because he went to college. Anyway, so my dad was born in 1929 in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, to immigrants. A lot of immigrants in my family, except on my mother's side. Because my dad was an immigrant, his parents were immigrants, twice over. I'm an immigrant, my sister's an immigrant, everybody's an immigrant. My wife's...
What's wrong with you damn people?
Yeah, my wife's not, but... Except we immigrated to the state from another state, which technically a state is a country. But anyway. So my dad was born in 1929, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. They lived in the neighborhood of James Bay. My grandfather was of Irish stock. My grandmother was Scottish stock, possibly of Irish stock. I mean, my grandmother was from Scotland, let's put it that way. But possibly of Irish stock. And my favorite football club, Glasgow Celtic, also known as Glasgow Celtic. But anyway, so my father, as a boy, he was the mascot for the Victoria Wharf Rats, which was a football club in Victoria, BC, Canada. And I don't know how people survive over there, because over here on the East Coast, it gets cold in the winter, but the summers are hot and muggy. But I've been in Victoria. I've been on Vancouver Island. I've been in Vancouver itself. And I've been in White Rock and Richmond and different parts of BC in the middle of summer. And at night it was cold. In the middle of summer. So how they survived, I don't know. There was this place I went to. It's like a botanical garden sort of place. It's like a big greenhouse. They have a butterfly enclosure. And when my dad was a boy, that was a swimming pool. And they brought water in from the ocean into there. But because it's salt water, it corroded everything, so it couldn't stay open forever because the expense of upkeep was just too much. But I don't know what school he went to or anything like that, but like I said, he was the mascot for the Victoria Wharf Rats, and I used to have some old black and white pictures of him. The football, back then they used leather footballs, and they wore boots instead of shoes the way they do now. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, football. Football, F-U-T-B-O-L.
Soccer.
Yeah, what you probably call soccer. But I'm from Spain, and we call it football. Anyway. So, my grandfather was a merchant marine. So, what do you think my dad wound up doing? He became a merchant marine as well. Up there they call it the Merchant Navy. Or at least they did. I don't know what they call it today. During the war, my grandfather was first engineer in the Canadian Navy. My father, on the other hand, I don't know what his position, rank, title, whatever was, probably not very high, because he was only 16 years old. He ran away from home and joined the Merchant Navy. Wound up doing the North Atlantic run. My grandmother, she's like, where's my boy? Where's my son? Where did Jimmy run off to? We don't know, Mama, we don't know. Finally, my aunties gave in. He went and joined the war. And my grandmother was not happy. He was only 16 years old, mind you. And it's 1945 now. And, before that, he was the mascot for the Victoria Wharf Rats. When he got older, he played for the Victoria Wharf Rats, which the club is no more. The club's long gone. He was during the North Atlantic run. My grandmother found out. She got mad. She went to her MP. MP is a member of Parliament. Her MP, she said, you know, I vote for your party. You better find my son. And the MP said, yes, ma'am, Mrs. O'Connor, we're going to find your son. He's like, oh gosh, I think I messed with the wrong person here.
It's not the wrong woman.
Yeah. So they found my dad. Where was my dad? He was in England. He had already arrived over in England. And they detained him. He was in a jail cell. So he was
mad at his mother.
Probably so. And they were giving him cigarettes and, you know, all that. And they're like, well, we're not letting you go until we find out how old you really are, boy. And he said, but I'm 18. I'm 18. You're giving me cigarettes, so you must think I'm 18. They didn't fall for that, because, I mean, when I was his age, I smoked too. So, you know, back then you could buy cigarettes at our age and nobody said anything. So, what happened? The British said, we got too much going on over here, we cannot babysit a kid. So they sent him back to Canada, North Atlantic run. My grandmother was not happy about that. It was very dangerous in those waters. The fascists could, with their aircraft, could go like halfway across the Atlantic. Then you have the U-boats. Then you have the surface ships. And the Nazis had, what they would do is they would take merchant vessels and they would take merchant vessels and arm them, but they were disguised. They looked like merchant vessels. And they would get out there and, you know, there's an Allied merchant vessel, and they would open up on it. So it was very dangerous. There were far more lives lost in the Canadian Merchant Navy, or excuse me, in the U.S. Merchant Marine, than there were lives lost in the U.S. Navy during that time. I assume the similar numbers for the Canadian service. So you were safer being in the Navy than being in the merchant service. My step-grandfather was on the battleship Texas during the war. Our chaplain in Okinawa was on Okinawa as a, you know, like a private or something during the war. On Okinawa. You know, 20 years later he's back on the island. But anyway, so, you know, like I said, my father played football, and he had worked on different ships under different flags, and he said, you know, I like working for the Americans the best. They're the ones who let me learn, you know, they'll answer my questions, they'll show me how to do things, they let me do things, so I like them. So I think I'm going to go and work under their flag. So he went to the mainland, you know, he's from the island, Vancouver Island. And, you know, before this, my father and grandfather, you know, they would like, if they want to go on holidays, which you'd call a vacation, I guess, the way they would do is they'd work their way somewhere. I used to have pictures of Scotland. They were working on oil rigs. They'd work their way over there, and then, you know, they would get a job to have money, and then they would work their way back home. It was pretty cool. But so my father was going up to the frontier, the border, and the frontier guard, the American, he says, "Where you going, boy?" "Yes, sir, I have a football match in Seattle." And he's like, "Yeah, I bet you do." "Oh, sir, I really do. Honestly, sir, I have a football match in Seattle." "No, you don't." "I do, sir. We're playing such and such a, you know, club." "I don't believe you, but go ahead and go." And he went, and as soon as he got out of sight of the guards, he threw all his gear away. You know, they wore the boots back then, not the shoes. And he threw everything away, went to the Merchant Marine Hall, signed up. And he worked that way for a while. But then guess what happened? The U.S. government found out he was here illegally. So what happened? Well, at that point the Korean War was going on. So, and he was already a ship's engineer at this point. Okay. I mean, he had his ticket as a ship's engineer. Ticket would be like your certificate. But he had his ticket as a ship's engineer. I don't know what level. I know he got. He didn't get his diesel ticket until he went to the U.S. Navy. So he had his his steam ticket, his coal ticket, or whatever. But the U.S. government found out he was here illegally. They went and said, "Boy, you either have to go home to Canada, or you have to join, or you have to, register for the draft." What did my dad do? He joined the Army. He went into the 6th Infantry Division. He was a private. After a while, he had boot camp that he had to go to. Then he had AIT, which was Infantry 6 ID, which was out at Fort Ord, California. Fort Ord is bye-bye. It's no longer. So he was, I don't know everything that happened, but at one point somehow he wound up on mainland Japan with a sleeve full of stripes, and wasn't in the Army very long. He was just in there a short time. So how he got all those stripes, I don't know. And now let me tell you something. My father and aunties had, well, especially my father, they had friends whose parents were from Japan, but they were from Canada, and they grew up together. My dad spoke multiple languages, and Japanese was one of them. Well, how did he learn Japanese? Because of his friends. When the war came, the Canadian government told them that you either go back to Japan, or you have to move to the interior. And they're like, well, if you trust us that much, why stay? So they went back to Japan, even though the kids aren't even from Japan. What happened? At least 2 of them joined the Imperial Japanese Navy. So, essentially, my father and grandfather and step-grandfather are fighting their friends. Although, my step-grandfather was both in the Atlantic and Pacific, my real grandfather and my dad were in the Atlantic. And my mom's dad was in the First World War, not the Second. But anyway, so my father, he has all these stripes, and then the government goes to him, the military goes to him and say, "Hey, boy, are you a ship's engineer by any chance?" He said, "Yes, sir, I am." He says, we asked you about that. You didn't tell us. Why not?" "Well, sir, I believe that immigrants, I believe that people native born to the country are the ones who should get the rank and the niceties." And they say, "You know what? We don't care what you think or how you feel about anything. We asked you a question, and you better answer truthfully." So he was transferred into the Navy with a commission, because he was already a ship's engineer. They needed ship's engineers at the time. So he winds up serving in the U.S. Army, and then in the U.S. Navy during the Korean War. One of his ships was the USS Shasta A6. Served on a number of ships, but that was one of them. When my parents met, my father was stationed at Norfolk, which is interesting because my mom's family arrived in Virginia in 1632 in a little town called Great Bridge, which is right outside of Norfolk. I think now it's more of a suburb rather than an actual town. But anyway, so when my parents got married in a little church in Aurora, North Carolina, because my father at that point was a naval officer, they held the swords up and they walked under the swords. which is kind of neat. And then my father was transferred to Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia Naval Yard, something like that. He had an office there. And then he went back into the Army. And he went in as a captain. He went back into the Army as a captain. And he wound up being stationed in Cadiz, España. He was port commander, and that's where I was born. Well, he was promoted to major right before I was born. And, you know, looking at the stuff and having listened to my parents, I think my parents loved Spain. I know I love Spain. If anybody knows my videos, you know I love Spain. And, I mean, geez, you know, we knew my parents knew people, got to do things, got to meet people, got to see places. And then he got his orders that he was going to Vietnam. Before that, he was on temporary duty, TTY, in Hanau, Deutschland. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Nein, sprechen Sie Deutsch. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Nein, sprechen Sie Deutsch. Yet my wife is of German stock. I'm of Celtic stock, in more ways than one. The Spanish, the Scottish, and the Irish. Although we should always start with the Irish and Spanish first. Okay, so, and my dad, before he goes to Vietnam, we come over to the United States. I don't really remember that. I remember, like, one thing from that entire year. Except in Canada. I mean, I remember the one thing. We lived in Virginia, but we went to Canada to visit his family first. And I remember several things from that part of the trip. That was fun. Met my grandmother. Don't remember meeting my granddad, but I know I met him. Got to meet all my cousins and all that. And then he went to Vietnam. He was company commander of 329th Transportation Corps Heavy Boat Company. And that was in Tan Son Nhut, South Vietnam. He resigned his commission after that. Why did he resign his commission? Because he didn't like what he saw. Mind you, this is a guy who served in World War II, Korea, and now Vietnam. So he knew what war was. And if you look back at the history of our family, my dad's side of the family, we had 3 family members who were hung in Mexico who were members of the St. Patrick's Brigade. We're a long way from ignorant of war and conflict, battle and combat. Too many family members have gone through it, and some haven't come back. My Uncle Alf's youngest brother, he married my auntie by blood. My Uncle Alf's youngest brother was in the RAF. He was on a Haley Page Halifax. They were making a bombing run over Germany, and they got shot down, and he didn't come home. But anyway, so my dad does his tour in Vietnam. Never talked to me about it. Never heard him talk about it. Well, when we were on Okinawa, we lived on Okinawa for 5 wonderful years. I loved Okinawa. And like somebody else was saying something about the unit, the 329th, the government made it look like they were de-escalating, they were withdrawing. Well, see, Okinawa, they did that kind of BS as well. They closed bases. How did they close a base? They renamed it. So, technically, this base is no longer, we closed the base. The base is still there, it just has a different name now. You know, and that's the way they do with units. Officially, a unit is withdrawn, even though the entire force of that unit is still over there. They're just assigned to another unit or something like that. It's like crazy stuff, man. So, anyway, my dad was in Vietnam, I think, 66, 67. And we were on Okinawa 67, 72, I believe. After my parents divorced, my father went inactive reserves. Before that, he was active reserves. And I don't know every place he was stationed. He was stationed, or he worked out of Galveston with the Corps of Engineers for a while. Then he went back to active reserves, and he was stationed in Florida at the Space Center out there. Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, whatever it's called. And another thing, while my father was in the Navy, he invented a device. Because he was in the Navy, guess who gets the invention? The Navy does, not him. He doesn't get credit for it, the Navy gets credit for it. It was a sounding device retriever, something like that. It's retrieving a sounding device. It's the way you tell if you still have fuel in the tank of a ship. And yeah, I'm like really technical about when people say ship or boat. Don't say boat to me if it's a ship. I'll say something to you. Yeah, like I said, you know, my father and my grandfather were both merchant marine. My father and grandfather were both Navy. My Uncle Alf was a longshoreman. I had a family member lost at sea because he was a merchant marine. So it runs in the family. And I happen to like ships myself. I'd love it to have a schooner, 100, 125-foot schooner, 135, 140-foot schooner, 3 or 4 masts. It'd be nice. Maybe a 5-masted schooner. All wood, of course. Anyway, so one thing my father did was they were testing like missile systems or something, like tracking systems. I don't know exactly what. Now, when we were in Okinawa, my father took me to this one base on the east coast of Okinawa, and he took me on a submarine. There were 2 subs that I remember there. One had a Special Forces logo on it. The other one had nothing on it. That's the one we went to, the one with nothing on it. I remember my dad handing things off when we went to this place or that place as well. So I don't know what my dad was into. There we have slides of my dad hanging out with Special Forces guys in Vietnam. I don't know, he wasn't Special Forces, but he was obviously into something. And anyway, I know it's like when we lived in Germany, my parents wanted to go to West Berlin, but they weren't allowed to because my father's security clearance. They could not risk him being captured or being arrested or detained or whatever. So her father was stationed, like I said, out in Florida, and he was a 4-pack-a-day smoker. And he had something in his throat, couldn't get rid of it. Went to the Army doctor. The Army doctor said, "You have terminal cancer, sir." And well, at that point, he was no longer an officer. He was a warrant officer because he resigned his commission. But then he went ahead and retired. And as per policy at the time, when you retired at your highest grade. And since his highest grade was major, he retired at the rank of major. And he passed away a year later. And that's all I really can say right now. But that's my dad. Bye.